letter to the Glasgow Herald, and it was basically buckshot from the waist, where it said, "There's a huge statue to a guy called Sir Walter Scott stuck in the middle of George Square in Glasgow, and it's like hundreds of feet in this big plinth. And then there's a wee statue about 50 yards across there to Rabbie Burns." And I thought, well, during the 1870s, 1880s, etc., there's a period when there was a cult of Burns, but by the 1830s, before this, the rich merchants and tobacconists and people who'd been in the slave trade in Scotland and Glasgow wanted to usurp Burns as our national poet. So they built this massive monument to Sir Walter Scott. And I thought, I was studying Burns at the time and thought, you sods should level this to the bloody ground and put a statue to Burns up to the head level of most people, because he didn't want to be above anybody. Right. So I wrote a letter to the Herald and I said, level this bloody statue. He was nothing to do with this. He's a reactionary Tory, so-and-so. Tried to make it reasonably intelligible. And they published it. And then Dr. Jim McGregor wrote to me saying, with sort of self-effacement, that he read the letter, I wish he could write like me, and should we meet up? So we met because of Burns. And he's produced such work since then. Yeah. I'm in awe of what he does.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And he writes 10 times better.
No. Here.
Yay, Jim.
That's the connection. When it comes to Burns, it's been nice to have had a sort of informal discussion before we start. A key point about Burns is, when he's learning his poetry, right, he's from Highland and Lowland blood. The family moved down to Ayr, and the father gets work down there. And as Murdoch, his teacher, is educating him, he falls in love with English poetry first of all, but then there's a magic thing happens. He meets Ferguson's poetry, and he meets Ramsay's poetry. And he hears the language of the heart there, the language of what he's used with, the natural thing you would speak in your house. So basically, Scotland's always had this, happened at Burns's time, a sort of cultural schizophrenia where we can speak very polite, clear English. Because the truth is, culturally, we've been dominated by our bigger neighbour. Yeah. And so Burns learns English and Scots. He's got two languages. And you see that in Tam O'Shanter, when he switches gear. If you know the long poem Tam O'Shanter. But, about the poppies and the river, etc. He goes straight into English. Coleridge loved that. The fact he could change gear, he had two languages. But one of the key things Burns does when he first publishes his poems in the Scots language, because that's his forte, is he goes to Edinburgh, and the so-called Enlightenment there, this is when we're still putting people in the jail for being witches. Yeah. Question mark about the Scottish Enlightenment, footnoted straight away, is that he goes to Edinburgh and they encourage him to drop the Scotticisms. It's like, oh my God, chap, don't use those bloody Scots words. Nobody understands them anymore. So what we've got is almost like a sort of cultural lobotomy that's in slow motion going on. And they try and tell Burns, don't write anything more on the Scots, just leave it. Burns, following his instinct in the sense of his own fame once he gets stuff published, decides, stuff it. He went and met the smartest minds of his time, and he said he left Edinburgh once he publishes his second edition, which is the big main one in Edinburgh. He left all these great Enlightenment people having learned nothing from him. Because he was self-educated. Murdoch gave him basically a liberal arts course of all the best books you could read at the time. None of the nonsense and stuff in the media or social media we have now. It's filtered to the great books. And one of them is Adam Smith, it's Voltaire, it's Rousseau, and it's the stuff from America. He is caught in the wind of that gale blowing from America. So from Washington and the whole lot of them there, it's the ideas of equality that are coming across. So he gets caught up in that. And the book I was lucky enough to do with Professor Noble, the remit was contextualise his later poems and songs into the political culture. And we did that. I think it caused a stir. Lots of people a few years back preferred to see Burns as an establishment man. it's something out of 1984 by Orwell, that Burns was a bit like Winston Smith. He loved the Union, supposedly, and he was a fan of William Pitt. But this is complete and utter nonsense. He is no fan of William Pitt. And we see from later that he was publishing stuff anonymously. A Man's a Man was published anonymously. Scott Sower Hay was published anonymously. I'll read a couple of wee bits from this, and I could go on and on, but I won't, so I'll spare you of that.
Paddy, why was it published? Why were they published anonymously?
Because of the sedition laws, you were not meant to be seen to be criticising the Crown. And if you're criticising the Crown, that could be seen as regicide.
I see.
Or for sedition, we shipped people away. Thomas Muir was shipped away for, you know. So this is the time when they take over the newspapers.
Yeah.
Because you get the newspapers coming through, first of all, and they're not controlled. And the elites don't like it, so they were literally kicking and smashing the doors in.
Wow.
They've done that to the Morning Chronicle, so that's when they take over the media. We now talk about media management and control of the public mind just about by memes and phrases. Back then, there was a liberal intelligentsia, they got the printing press, and they were given it loudly, especially particularly Thomas Paine.
How are they identified as authentic Robert Burns poetry? You said these were published anonymously.
Oh, this is that I would need to go into a lot of detail for that. We could maybe have a different conversation with that. But lots of the eminent scholars looked at quite a few of them, and quite a few said that's a very good question. That was not an easy one.
Trying to get
I
that
could
out
mention that
myself.
later, but that would be another
That's fine.
half-hour presentation. Right, quick quote from William Roscoe. He became an MP. He's from Liverpool, and he wrote this in Burns' death. Go, builder of a deathless name, thy country's glory and her shame. Go and the immortal guerdon claim to genius due, whilst rolling centuries thy fame shall still renew. William Roscoe, 1796. Burns was elevated as the great poet and the great radical poet by the sort of underground people in London who were writing anonymously, pseudonymously, and by the London press. They invited him to go and live and work there. And so he sent off stuff anonymously and pseudonymously. He was doing that. But he was an exciseman, so he didn't want jailed. He didn't want caught. So he's a tightrope walker. He's lobbing stuff in, satire, various things. He wasn't going to
Throwing
shut up.
garbage at satellites.
Basic introduction to the book. I'm going to read it out. I've never done this before. Reading this stuff for you. The life of Burns is the story of a remarkable triumph over poverty and adversity. The odds were heavily stacked against the peasant poet bursting on the scene during the late Enlightenment. Yet, at 27 years of age, Burns produced his Kilmarnock edition, and became briefly the darling of fashionable literary Edinburgh. He was patronised as the heaven-taught ploughman, one of a clutch of iconic myths that continue to obscure the real mettle of the man. Throughout the vicissitudes of his tragically short life, he never totally abandoned himself to bitterness, never shed his social idealism, and never lost his innate sense of destiny as a poet. He was sustained through the harshest of times, economically and politically, by an inner certainty that his work would endure down the centuries. His prescience has been amply vindicated. It was seen in A Man's a Man that Jim read out that you see the values of his education. Some of it's Presbyterian, some of it's from the Bible, and some of it's Thomas Paine, etc. So he's filtering all these ideas, as we would do. And you see these motifs coming through all of his work. I'm going to read a bit from a piece, just a simple narrative song. My father was a farmer upon the Carrick border. You might have heard the song. It's simple, but there's always that bit of honesty or independence of mind that the same things coming through. My father was a farmer upon the Carrick border, and carefully he bred me in decency and order. He bade me act a manly part, though I ne'er had a farthing o', for without an honest manly heart no man was worth regarding o'. Oh, and this is the last verse. All you who follow wealth and power with unrelenting ardour, the more in this you look for bliss, you leave your view the farthest though. Had you the wealth Potosi boasts, or nations to adore you, a cheerful, honest-hearted clown I will prefer before you. Well, you can apply these values. Burns is universal. You can apply these values. If you look at things like to a mouse, kids in primary schools will recite the poor wee timid and beastie, etc. And yet, the great writers get the point that this is the ancient mariner in miniature, of mice and men, etc. And the poor wee mouse. Burns starts off with a specific, and he goes on about that's the peasantry's life. So he's ploughed over this little hillock where the mouse lived, and suddenly this hillock becomes a metaphor for the Scottish peasantry. Yeah? And that metaphor, as it goes from specific to the general to the universal, like he does in A Man's a Man. It's an enlightenment sort of thinking process that's going on. That's why people write books and title them Mice and Men. So the people who write literature tend to, what's the cliche? The best writings write the best writings. The best poets read the best poets. They influence each other.
Yeah.
And you guys that are writers and thinkers will know that. You look for the stuff you enjoy most, and it's infused into your thinking. And it's difficult not to semi-plagiarise those people you love as writers and thinkers. So what we find in Burns' writings is that infusion of all of his culture at that period. I'm talking the Enlightenment, English radical poetry, and even English republicanism, which goes right back, believe it or not, they suppress it, the Commonwealth man, etc. So there's ideas in the culture that he's attuned to. And what Professor Noble and I tried to do with the Canongate was show this isn't a peasant poet, it's heaven taught. This isn't a guy that's tuned into somebody else writing it, going, okay, I'll just scribble it down. I'm just a scribe, somebody else up there's writing it. He's not a heaven taught poet. He's labouring over the stuff. He writes Tam O'Shanter 5 or 6 versions. And yet you go to an SNP Burns night and they'll stand there and say, they'll give it loudly, and the 2 best days in Scotland were Bannockburn, where we slaughtered the English, and the second one was when Rabbie Burns wrote Tam O'Shanter in a day. The second one was complete bollocks. Poets craft their stuff. Look at Leonard Cohen, the songwriter and poet. Every poet, unless you're maybe Samuel Taylor Coleridge and you've taken opium and you write it and you're spaced out your face, Kubla Khan,
What are you suggesting he did?
I'm suggesting that Coleridge did. He did. But I don't know what influenced Burns more than women or Scottish patriotism. But that he was a Scottish patriot, there is no doubt. And the singular act that he did by deciding to write in Scots, this might seem a bigger conclusion than it merits, but in a sense, if he had not stemmed the tide of Anglicisation of our culture, we probably would, well, in some ways, he tried to, it's been diluted, and lots of Scots struggle to understand the words he used because he's trying to preserve the culture. Because in some ways you get a cultural schizophrenia if you forget your culture. If an individual forgets their past and has no memory of their past, they're effectively schizophrenic, are they not? If you don't see who and what you are. So, I probably shouldn't confess, but both myself and Professor Noble were pro-independence, and this book, we emphasised the politics. To be true to the poet, but at the same time to try and get the language out there back into the culture. To use Enlightenment language is much richer. Read the Trial of Thomas Muir and Muir's speech from the dock. I think the American culture, and particularly the American people, some of the more educated, I think during...
Can you just see who Thomas Muir was?
Thomas Muir was a QC, a young QC, who in his 20s was arrested for speaking sedition. So Burns later wrote that he might as well, he too could have shared Muir and Palmer's fate. So with A Man's a Man, that's why it was printed anonymously. He feared being arrested. He feared
Everybody sees that what's happening today is just been going on for so long.
The sedition laws and the oppression.
What was Muir's fight? What was Muir's fight?
Muir was sent to Botany Bay. And there's an epic film waiting to be done. If only there was money in Scotland to do it. He escaped from Botany Bay and he ends up coming back to France. The most famous living Scot at that time wasn't Burns, it was Thomas Muir. The news spread all over the world. So Muir is probably the most famous Scot, but Burns and him are not meant to have met. Right, I'm going to try and do a wee song, see if I can do it. I'm not really much of a singer, but I'll give it a go. And then I'm going to finish off with Scott Swahili, so I'm hoping Julie's going to sing because she can sing.
Really?
Aaron can sing.
Duet.
What, to this? I don't know.
Yes, you just sang it a minute ago.
No, I didn't.
Right, this is one of the songs that he did, that he wrote. It's published anonymously. He was an exciseman. He was not allowed to be political. So this is one of the most political poets ever, and yet he's working in that sort of cauldron where he's got to send them out anonymously. He's writing for 2 collections of songs in Edinburgh, and he just doesn't put his name. Doesn't put his name to many of them at all.
Tell us a wee bit about what the song is.
Sorry?
To tell us a wee bit about what the song is
The
about.
song I'm going to do, it's called Parcel of Rogues. This one applies every week when you think of the situation in Westminster, but he wrote it about the situation in Scotland. The Scottish Parliament voted itself out of existence. They decided to join England. So that's one
Not
of
the
the...
Scottish people, the Scottish nobility.
The Scottish nobility.
And they were bribed with English gold. So this is what Burns is. So,
I usually washing machine this. I start one verse, I forget another bit, and go on and make a mess of it, but I'll try and do as best I can. In fact, I'll sit there and do it. Let's try that. That's okay, I've scribbled it here, so...
Could you do one
I rarely sing, I don't mind speaking. Singing, it's like, well, somebody else can do that. So it's Parcel of Rogues. So we'll dedicate this to Boris Johnson. Hope this is not being videoed. They are Scottish fame, farewell to ancient glory, farewell into the Scottish name, say famed in martial story, you sovereigns o'er the Southern South, and Tweed runs to the ocean to mark where England's province stands. Sick a parcel of rogues in a nation, oh, what force or guile could not subdue. Through many warlike ages is wrought not by a coward few, for hireling traitors' wages. Oh, the English still we could disdain, secure in Valor Station, but English gold has been ordained. Sick a parcel of rogues in a nation. Oh, would or I had seen the day the treason us could sell us. My old grey heat had lain in clay, with Bruce and Lyle Wallace, but pith and power till my last hour. I'll make this declaration: we were bought and sold for English gold. Sick a parcel of rogues in a nation, sick a parcel of rogues in a